Good morning. Good morning. Let's pray before we have our class this morning. Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful unto Thee for the blessings we have. As a body of believers, we approach Thy throne of grace with reverence and with understanding that Thou art God. Pray that Thou would bless our class, bless the other classes, bless our worship as we enter into it later this morning. Pray that Thou would give us all wisdom and good judgment in discerning Thy word and help us to understand. Pray for guidance as we do that. Then as we leave our worship service this morning, we pray that Thou would help us to do good, to spread Thy word. Help us to that end in Jesus' name. Amen. First 12 chapters of the book of Isaiah, there's a focus on, the prophet focused on Israel, and particularly he focuses on Judah. And within the first 12 chapters, there's a lot of reference to the New Covenant era, a lot of reference to the Messiah, the Messianic age. And now the prophet turns his attention to Babylon. Now, Babylon, at the time that the prophet was prophesying, was Babylon a world power? What was the dominant nation then? Assyria. Babylon was a little old country, so to speak, a little old country area. Babylon was not it would be like, somebody saying that today, prophesying that North Korea was going to be a big empire, a dominant world empire. Babylon. So what do we know about Babylon? When the Jews were carried into captivity, into Babylonian captivity, we learned something about Babylon. And of course, the Babylon of the future of Isaiah's prophecies here. We learned something about Babylon. In the second chapter, we learn that Babylon was a mighty power. And who was the king of, at the time of Daniel, who was the king of Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar. He was a mighty fellow. And in the second chapter of Daniel, you might want to turn there, he saw a great image. Now, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all Hebrews, were, advisors to the king. And Daniel, the king Nebuchadnezzar, had a dream, and he didn't remember the dream, and he wanted an interpretation of a dream that he didn't remember. And all of his soothsayers and all the wise people that he had surrounding him couldn't help him out, and so they called Daniel. Now remember, Daniel right there in the midst of this great Babylonian empire. And Daniel says, "O thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible." That was awesome. This image head was of fine gold, his breast and arms of silver, his belly and his thigh of brass, and his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Now, gold has typically has a greater value. Silver has a lesser value. Bronze or brass has a lesser value per unit. And then this iron and legs, the iron of iron and clay, the legs of this colossal image. So now, all of us know what this is about. So the head of gold, and Daniel explains this, the head of gold was whom? Was what nation? What empire? The Babylonian. Okay, the arms and chest, this silver, represented what? What? Medo-Persian. And it's important, is the Medo-Persian Empire. And then the brass part was Grecian, Alexander the Great. And then, of course, the feet of iron and clay, feet and toes, legs, the Roman Empire. And so we all realize that. We've heard that 100 times, I suppose. And so what the message there is, this Babylonian Empire was a choice empire. If we go to Daniel 5, we pick up on another scene there in the life of Daniel as he worked in that empire. And there was a son or grandson of Nebuchadnezzar by the name of Belshazzar. He was a king. But remember, drawing on your knowledge of Daniel, what was happening there when Daniel was dealing with Belshazzar? Remember, there was a hand writing on the wall. Remember that? And this grandson, I think it was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Mark, does that sound right? The grandson. They were having a big deal, and they were kind of inebriated, and they were drinking out of some of the cups of the temple. And all at once there was a hand writing on the wall. And what did that inscription on the wall mean? What was the import of that inscription? Done. God has kind of looked at the kingdom, and it was hanging in the balances, and what? Found wanting. So, we have that bit of history here that we need to consider as we look at the oracle here of Babylon. So here, like a century and a half or so later, Isaiah is talking about things, 150 or so years in the future, and talking about Babylon. And Babylon wasn't much of a force in the international scene at that time. So the burden of Babylon. Stop right there. The burden of Babylon. Any translations have a different than burden? What's it? Oracle. Okay. That doesn't help me though. Oracle. I'm trying to understand what this is. Oracle, burden. What else?
Oracle is a word, a reference to judgment that is coming.
Okay. The judgment. Burden. Oracle. Judgment. Denunciation. That would be a good word for this. The denunciation of Babylon. God is announcing the denunciation of Babylon before Babylon became a prominent world power. Now, that's pretty, in terms of human thinking, that's pretty impressive. You know, isn't a Gene Dixon prediction, or some dude making some. Now, Gene Dixon, some of you young pups don't know anything of it. Gene Dixon was a woman that did a lot of, soothsaying, forecasting, predicting, and so forth. Wrong about 90% of the time, but, she had a name there. But anyway, this was the real McCoy here. The burden, the oracle, the denunciation, the judgment of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see. Now, what good did it do? What good do you suppose it did for Isaiah to, announce this? And probably he was preaching this sort of thing to the Jewish people, to the people of Judah. What good was that? What good would it do to be pronouncing judgment in the future on Babylon? Well, Babylon and Judah, their histories came together.
Well, I was going to say, it also showed that he wasn't essentially rewarding those who were evil, just a tool.
Yeah. That's a good point. He was not, he used them, but then they were an evil bunch. Let's think about this. How evil was this Nebuchadnezzar? How evil was he? He threw the three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, threw them in the fiery furnace, right? Isn't that the dude that did that? Yeah. I mean, that kind of showed his mentality. Of course, God punished him. He spent 7 years as like an animal, until he learned that there is a God in heaven who rules the nations. That was the point of that. Here's the God of the Hebrews, the God of heaven, rules in the affairs of men. And that's, Mark, is that still the case? What? That God rules in the affairs of men. Huh? Now that might be scary for America, right? Ooh. I mean, that might be, whoever's the president of the United States is, the leader of the free world. Well, if America, and that shows you really the importance of spreading the gospel. The future of America. Now think about this for just a minute. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but think about it for just a minute. Maybe the future of America is tied with the extent to which the church evangelizes America. You think there could be any connection there?
Historically, I think you just want to go with Israel as an example. You have good leaders. The people tend to go in a proper way. If you don't, ties, it's often tied to the directional leadership leads the nation. If you have a godly leader leading godly principles, you have a better chance of not being destroyed or being puffed up.
Yeah, I mean, the future of America may relate to the future of the church. Is that right? And then we're just a lazy bunch of people in terms of evangelizing. In totality, Ned?
If you look at the fair booth for the years that we've been going, I mean, this last week on Wednesday, as we're trying to hand out literature, the guy walked by and just said, "We don't need more heathens." I mean, just blatant. There's no regard any longer. People aren't afraid to say, "We don't need more heathens," and just admit it. I'm sure he thinks he's joking, but yet the mentality. We don't need it. That's the idea.
Yeah.
We don't need it.
Another guy stopped by and said, "I'm a pagan." Spent several minutes telling Harold Dilley about he's a pagan. And trying to, this is why I'm a pagan. Well, and I'm sure all of us that worked at the booth, or will work at the booth, and today, run into, there's just so many folks that just want nothing to do with anything that relates to the Bible. But that doesn't mean we coop up ourselves in the building here and don't spread the word. So, the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see. Lift ye up a banner upon the high mountain. Now, this is going to be a visual. Did you ever see a high mountain? You look at a high mountain, and let's suppose you saw an image there. You saw words on that high mountain. You say, "Wow, that's a big event. That's something." A circus is coming to town, or more than that. That's a visual. Lift up ye a banner on the high mountain, and the voice unto them. Now that's audio. We got a banner, visual, then audio. Lift up the voice unto them, and shake the hand, that they may go into the gates of the nobles. Who are the nobles here? Big shots running Babylon. The people that are in charge, the people that have the resources and are in charge. So this is going to be, visual, audio, and then the movement of God's hand, so to speak, there. I have commanded my sanctified ones. God says, I've commanded my sanctified ones. Now, that word sanctified just means what? Designated, those chosen, set apart for mine anger. Now, Babylon is going to be destroyed, and God has sanctified. He has dedicated, he has appointed people to destroy Babylon. I mean, this is in the future. He's appointed people to destroy Babylon. Why did he want to destroy Babylon? Before that, why did he want the Babylonians to destroy Assyria? Now think about that. Why were these... why did he want to destroy Judah? Of course, a remnant came back, but why did he want to destroy them? You see, people don't, they don't really think about. Sometimes people laugh at stupid people doing evil things. It's kind of interesting, I suppose, in some mind. But God, God doesn't look upon evil, with any smile. I mean, evil. God punishes evil. You see, that's the issue there. And He's appointed some of these folks, and we'll get to the point. Isaiah eventually identify something about who that would be. I have commanded my sanctified ones. I have also called my mighty ones for mine anger. This is going to be, whoever's destroying Babylon is going to be a mighty force, militarily, going to be mighty. He's angry with the Babylonians, and he's commissioned somebody to destroy them. I've called my mighty ones for mine anger, even them that rejoice in my highness. The noise of the multitude in the mountains. Now, this is going to be this destruction of Babylon is going to be pretty noisy. The noise of the multitude in the mountains, like a great people. The tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations. Now, between chapter 13 and 23 of Isaiah, there's going to be a denunciation. Isaiah is going to pronounce a denunciation on a dozen nations. Okay? Kind of consider that, remember that. That there's, as we study the next 10 chapters, not 8 or 10 chapters, there's going to be a denunciation of at least a dozen specific peoples. So the noise in the mountains, like a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations, Babylon isn't going to have any friends when this judgment comes. There's not going to be a lot of people coming around to give them military assistance. We gathered together in verse 4. The Lord of hosts mustereth the host of the battle. That word mustereth. The Lord of hosts mustereth the host of battle. The host, the troops, the multitudes that are involved in this battle. What's that word mustereth? Huh? Mustering. Okay. What's that word? Is there another word used in one of the other translations other than mustereth? Mustereth.
Military term, but I haven't been in the military.
It has to do with, he's assembling. He's putting together. God's the one that is putting together this military action against the Babylonians. He mustereth. They're going to come. They're going to come from a far country, maybe a country that's not even known at the time that this prophecy was pronounced. And in verse 5, well, let's look at verse 5 together then. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord, and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Now, Babylon is going to be destroyed. In that, as we think of that, in the past, think of some other areas where God obliterated, where he completely destroyed. Can you think of some other places that God completely destroyed? Well, Sodom and Gomorrah. Huh? Sodom and Gomorrah are the ones that jump out at us. Edom was, but where's Sodom and Gomorrah today? That land area, that real estate. What? Probably under the Dead Sea. Okay? Now, over time, what country lives in, or what race of people live in the old site of Babylon? Huh? I'm saying, what people live? What? Huh? What? Yeah, but the actual real estate of where Babylon once was. Huh? It's barren, full of snakes, full of wild creatures. Isn't that something? Full of wild creatures. And we're going to, let's listen as we come to that. They come from a far country to destroy. Howl ye, beller, what's another word? Howl. What? Wail. Yeah, wail. Wail. For the day of the Lord is at hand. Now, when the scriptures use the day of the Lord is at hand, what does that kind of what jumps out at you there? The day of the Lord, the day of Jehovah. What jumps out at you?
It's used in a lot of ways, a lot of different things. Typically it means destruction in one way or another on someone.
Yeah. And then there's going to be a final day of the Lord. But the day of the Lord, is there some big event? The end of the world, the end of the age, the end of the Christian age. A day of the Lord. It's not a day of, I almost said Trump. It's not the day of Obama. It's not the day of Trump. It's not the day of Eisenhower or George Washington or some other man. Day of the Lord. That's a ultra important event. Shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Wonder why he uses the word Almighty there. God is Almighty, but I wonder why the prophet uses the word Almighty. Well, the emphasis on he has the power to do it. Therefore, verse 7, shall all hands be faint, weak, and every man's heart shall melt. And they shall be afraid. Now here's this mighty kingdom operated by Nebuchadnezzar, and then later on by his son, and then by Belshazzar. And they're all, they're invincible in their own mind. Nothing's going to happen to them. Let's go over. Let's go over the 5th chapter of Daniel. We referenced that earlier. And Daniel was there present. Belshazzar, or Shazar, chapter 5 of Daniel. The king made a great feast to the thousands of the lords. Now look at this. Here's an assembly of thousands of important people in Babylon. feast to 1,000, it says, 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the thousands. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden, he commanded that the golden and silver vessels from his father Nebuchadnezzar that had been taken out of the temple which was at Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Now, that took a lot of brass, to be drinking out of those sacred vessels. And, it showed their arrogance, and they and their princes and their wives and his concubines had all the biggies of the they're assembled. They're drinking wine, and you see, if there were 1,000 nobles, there were probably 1,000 women connected with them. And probably some of them had 2 or 3 women. I don't know. It was wouldn't have been anything in their law that would have prohibited that in their law. And they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron. That's gold, silver, brass, and iron. Related to those kingdoms, and of wood. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed. He's gotten he's kind of sobering up here. Sobering up without whatever he might have used to sober up. And this hand wrote, then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one another together, or one against another. His knees were knocking. The king cried aloud to bring the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said unto the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then came all the wise men, but they could not read the writing nor know the interpretation. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts be troubled, nor let thy countenance be changed. There's a man in the kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father, and that could have meant grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, and the king, I say thy father, made masters of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. And so this queen, she's bringing up a little history here about Daniel. And then Daniel in verse 13 was brought before the king. And then in verse 17, Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known unto the interpretation. And O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, majesty, and glory, and honor. And for this majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. He was a mighty guy, whom he would have slain, and whom he would have kept alive, and whom he would set up and whom he would put down. He had, he had absolute authority on earth there. And then going down to verse 25, and this is the writing that was written. Mini Tekel Sarfison. This is the meaning of the thing. Meaning, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Thy kingdom is delivered into the Medes and Persians. Now, the first ruler of this new empire was, going down to verse 31, was Darius the Mede. And then Cyrus was a Persian. So this was a Medo-Persian empire. And the first ruler was Darius, and then Cyrus. Cyrus, the Persian, what did he do? What great thing did he do that relates to the Jews?
The Israelites, the nation, go back to Jerusalem.
Not only that, he gave them support. Any of you Jews want to go back to Jerusalem? Get on your mules and head back, and I'll give you provisions. So now, so it was in this here, decades and decades later, Daniel, reinforces the information that Isaiah presented, 150 years earlier or so. He says, your kingdom is gone. You've been weighed in the balances and you've been found wanting. And they shall be afraid. And so here the whole kingdom fell apart. Verse 8, and they shall be afraid. Pangs and sorrows shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth, or a woman giving childbirth. They shall be amazed at one another. Their faces shall be as flames. They'll be looking around at one another and wondered, how could this happen? That's kind of the idea. They look around and say, oh, what's happened? Behold, the day of the Lord cometh. Now there's that day of the Lord, the day of Jehovah. The day of Jehovah cometh. Cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof. He's going to lay that land desolate. Now it's going to take some time. Over time, the Babylonian territory, that where the city was, took some time. But today, as we said before, there's nothing there but snakes and wild creatures. Now, obviously, he's using metaphorical language here in verse 10. For the stars of heaven and the constellations shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. This is going to be cataclysmic. This is just a tremendous happening here. Now, I wonder why, and we won't have time to finish this thought, but I wonder why in the book of Revelation, in the 17th chapter, why Babylon is mentioned. In the 17th chapter, the book of, in the 17th and 18th chapters, I wonder why Babylonian is the word Babylon. I wonder why that's such a prominent part of the revelation of John. What does Babylon represent in Revelation? It represents that which is evil, right? Represents evil. It represents rebellion against God, right? Now, what happens when there's rebellion against God? There is punishment. There in physical Babylon, punishment, destruction. Let's pick up that thought next week.